The black sedan pulled up to the curb at exactly 7 o'clock in the evening, just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the old brick buildings of the Bellevaya neighborhood. Dante Cavallo sat in the back seat reviewing documents on his tablet, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. His driver, a thick-necked man named Paolo who had been with the family for 20 years, waited in silence for instructions. "This is the place?" Dante asked, though he already knew the answer. He had studied every photograph, every property record, every health inspection report. He knew this building better than its owner did, at least on paper. "Yes, sir. Nonna's Table, the Ferraro Women's Restaurant." Dante looked out the tinted window at the modest storefront. The facade was painted a warm terracotta color, faded by decades of sun and rain. A hand-painted sign hung above the door, the letters spelling out the restaurant's name in an elegant script that had probably been fashionable 50 years ago. Window boxes held red geraniums still blooming despite the cooling autumn weather. Through the windows, he could see white tablecloths, candles flickering in glass holders, and the shadows of diners moving about. It was charming, he supposed. Quaint. The kind of place food critics love to discover and write breathless articles about, calling it authentic and unspoiled. The kind of place that had no business existing in a neighborhood that was about to become the most valuable real estate development in the city's history. "She's expecting me?" Dante asked. Paolo shifted uncomfortably. "She's been informed of your intention to meet, sir. Whether she's expecting you or not, I couldn't say." Dante almost smiled. Paolo was diplomatic to a fault, which was why he had survived so long in this business. What he meant was that Elena Ferraro had refused every phone call, returned every letter unopened, and sent away every representative Dante had dispatched to discuss the purchase of her property. Most people, when they learned that Dante Cavallo wanted something they possessed, found ways to accommodate him. They negotiated. They made deals. They understood either explicitly or implicitly that cooperation was in their best interest. Dante's family had built their empire over 3 generations, starting with his grandfather's modest smuggling operation during the war and expanding into shipping, real estate, construction, and a dozen other legitimate and less legitimate enterprises. The Cavallo name meant something in the city. It meant power. It meant consequences. But Elena Ferraro had apparently not received this message. "Wait here," Dante said, tucking his tablet into his briefcase. "This shouldn't take long." He stepped out of the car and buttoned his jacket, a charcoal gray Tom Ford that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. The evening air was cool and carried the smell of garlic and roasting meat from the restaurant's kitchen. Despite himself, Dante's stomach rumbled. He had skipped lunch for a meeting with his accountants, and dinner had been postponed for this little excursion. The restaurant's door was wooden, heavy, with a brass handle worn smooth by thousands of hands over the years. Dante pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was exactly what he had expected from the photographs, yet somehow more. The warmth hit him first, both the temperature and something less tangible, a feeling of welcome that seemed embedded in the walls themselves. The restaurant was small, perhaps 15 tables arranged in a way that maximized intimacy without feeling cramped. The walls were exposed brick, decorated with old photographs, vintage advertisements for Italian products, and shelves holding bottles of wine and olive oil. The lighting was soft, provided by candles and a handful of antique fixtures that cast golden pools across the white tablecloths. Every table was full. Diners leaned toward each. Other in conversation, forks twirling pasta, wine glasses catching the light. A young waiter navigated between tables with practiced ease, balancing plates of food that smelled incredible. Somewhere in the back, Dante could hear the clatter of the kitchen, the sizzle of something hitting a hot pan. A woman approached him. She was in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and a white apron tied over her black dress. Her face was kind but guarded. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm here to see Elena Ferraro. She's expecting me." The woman's expression flickered, something passing across her features too quickly for Dante to identify. "And you are Dante Cavallo." He watched for the reaction, the recognition, the fear. It came, but only slightly, a tightening around the eyes, a subtle stiffening of the shoulders. This woman knew who he was. She just wasn't particularly impressed. "Wait here," she said. "I'll see if she's available." She disappeared through a door at the back of the restaurant. Dante stood by the entrance, aware of the curious glances from nearby diners. He was overdressed for this place, too polished, too expensive. He looked like exactly what he was, a predator in a room full of prey. A few minutes passed. Dante was not accustomed to waiting. He checked his watch, a Patek Philippe that had belonged to his father, and considered simply walking into the kitchen to find this woman who seemed determined to waste his time. Before he could act on this impulse, the door opened and Elena Ferraro emerged. She was not what he had expected. The photographs in his files had shown a woman who was attractive in an understated way, with dark hair and sharp features. But photographs could not capture the way she moved, confident and unhurried, or the intelligence in her dark eyes as she assessed him from across the room. She wore chef's whites, splattered with sauce and dusted with flour, and her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her hands were red and rough, the hands of someone who worked hard for a living. She crossed the room toward him, and Dante noticed that she did not smile. "Mr. Cavallo," she said. Her voice was lower than he had expected, slightly husky. "I was told you wanted to meet. I've been trying to arrange this meeting for 3 months. I've been busy." Running a restaurant that seats 40 people? Something flickered in her eyes. Irritation, perhaps. Running a restaurant that feeds 40 families every night. There's a difference. Dante inclined his head, acknowledging the point. "Is there somewhere we can speak privately?" Elena looked around the crowded dining room. For a moment, he thought she would refuse. Then she nodded toward the front door. "We close at 10. Come back at 11. The restaurant will be empty." "I have other engagements this evening." "Then cancel them." She met his gaze directly, without flinching. "If this conversation is important enough for you to show up, unannounced at my place of business, it's important enough to happen on my terms." Dante stared at her. In 38 years of life, in 2 decades of running an empire that spanned continents, he could not remember the last time someone had spoken to him this way. His associates feared him, his enemies avoided him, his lovers pleased him, and departed when he grew bored. But this woman, this chef with flour on her clothes and fire in her eyes, looked at him like he was nobody special. It was infuriating. It was also, he was surprised to discover, intriguing. 11 o'clock, he said finally. "I'll return." "Don't be late. I have prep work at 4 in the morning." She turned and walked back toward the kitchen without another word. Dante watched her go, noting the straight line of her spine, the purposeful rhythm of her steps. Then he pushed open the door and stepped back into the cool night air. Paolo was leaning against the sedan, smoking a cigarette. He straightened when he saw Dante emerge. "That was quick, sir. Did she agree to sell?" "We haven't discussed terms yet." Dante slid into the back seat. "We're returning at 11. Paolo raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He crushed out his cigarette and climbed behind the wheel. As the car pulled away from the curb, Dante looked back at the restaurant's glowing windows. Through the glass, he could see Elena Ferraro returning to the kitchen, disappearing into the warmth and chaos that was her domain. He had the strangest feeling that this negotiation was not going to go the way he had planned. Dante spent the intervening hours at his office, a sleek space on the 42nd floor of a building he owned in the financial district. The walls were glass, offering a panoramic view of the city's glittering skyline. The furniture was modern and expensive, all clean lines and leather and chrome. It was the office of a man who had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, a man who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. He tried to focus on work. There were contracts to review, decisions to make, problems to solve. His legitimate businesses alone would have consumed the full attention of most executives, and that was before accounting for the other operations, the ones that existed in shadows and whispers, the ones that had built the Cavallo fortune in the first place. But his mind kept drifting back to Elena Ferraro. He pulled up her file on his computer, scrolling through the information his investigators had compiled. Born 36 years ago, in the same neighborhood where her restaurant now stood. Father deceased when she was 16, mother deceased 5 years ago. No siblings, never married, no children. She had trained as a chef in Rome, worked in restaurants across Italy and France, then returned home to take over her family's business when her mother's health began to fail. The restaurant itself had a longer history. Founded in 1962 by Elena's grandmother, Rosa Ferraro, a widow who had survived the war and immigrated to America with nothing but a suitcase and a handful of recipes. Rosa had worked as a domestic servant for a wealthy family, saving every penny until she had enough to lease a small storefront in the neighborhood where other Italian immigrants had settled. She had cooked the food of her homeland, the simple peasant dishes she had learned from her own mother, and word had spread. By the time Rosa died in 1985, Nona's table was an institution. Elena's mother, Lucia, had taken over, maintaining the traditions while making small improvements. The menu remained largely unchanged. The recipes were closely guarded secrets, passed down through generations. Food critics praised the restaurant's authenticity, its refusal to chase trends, its stubborn commitment to quality. And now Dante wanted to tear it down to build luxury condominiums. He closed the file and stared out at the city lights. The Bellavia development project was the largest he had ever undertaken, a complete transformation of 12 square blocks from a working-class Italian neighborhood into an upscale residential and commercial district. The potential profits were staggering, hundreds of millions of dollars, enough to elevate the Cavallo family's legitimate holdings to a level where the other business could eventually be phased out. That was the plan, anyway. Dante's father had been a brutal man, ruling through fear and violence, comfortable with the bloody work of running a criminal empire. Dante was different. He had been educated at the finest schools, had traveled the world, had learned to appreciate art and wine and culture. He wanted to transition the family business into something clean, something respectable, something his children could inherit without shame. If he ever had children. If he ever found someone he wanted to have them with. He pushed that thought aside. The point was that the Bellavia project represented the future, a chance to build something legitimate on a foundation that had been, until now, built on darker things. Every other property owner in the development zone had agreed to sell. Some had done so eagerly, happy to cash out and relocate. Others had required more persuasion, gentle reminders of the benefits of cooperation, subtle implications about the consequences of refusal. None had required actual threats. The Cavallo name carried enough weight that threats were rarely necessary. But Elena Ferraro had refused. Again and again, she had refused. And Dante, who had a dozen lawyers and accountants and fixers who could handle this sort of problem, had decided to handle it himself. He told himself it was because the project was important. He told himself it was because he didn't like loose ends. He told himself it was because this stubborn woman was standing in the way of his legacy. But as the hours passed and the clock crept toward 11, he began to suspect that his reasons were more complicated than that. The restaurant was dark when he returned, the neon signs of neighboring businesses casting colored shadows across the empty street. Paolo parked the sedan at the curb and looked at Dante in the rearview mirror. "Should I wait, sir?" "Yes, I don't expect this to take long." Dante stepped out of the car and approached the restaurant's front door. The windows were dark, but when he tried the handle, it turned easily. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The dining room was transformed. Without the candles and the diners and the warm bustle of service, it felt like a different space entirely. The tables were bare, the chairs stacked, the floor freshly mopped. A single light burned in the back, spilling through the kitchen door. "Back here," called Elena's voice. Dante navigated through the empty dining room and pushed open the kitchen door. Elena sat at a small table in the corner of the kitchen, a cup of espresso in front of her. She had changed out of her chef's whites into jeans and a simple black sweater. Her hair was still pulled back, but more loosely now, and tendrils had escaped to frame her face. She looked tired, Dante thought. Tired but alert, like a soldier who had learned to function on little sleep. She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit." Dante sat. The chair was wooden, uncomfortable, clearly not designed for lingering. The kitchen around them was spotless, every surface gleaming, every pot and pan in its proper place. A large commercial stove dominated one wall, its burners cold. The smell of the evening's cooking still lingered, garlic and tomatoes and something herbal. "Would you like an espresso?" Elena asked. "Oh, thank you." She rose and moved to a small machine on the counter, her movements efficient and practiced. The machine hissed and gurgled, and a moment later she set a small cup in front of him. The espresso was perfect, dark, and rich with a thin layer of crema. "From the Ferraro file," Dante said, taking a sip. "Your grandmother used to serve espresso to her customers after every meal, on the house." "You've done your research." "I always do my research." Elena sat back down, wrapping her hands around her own cup. "Then you know that this restaurant has been in my family for 60 years. You know that my grandmother built it from nothing. You know that my mother worked herself to death to keep it open, and you know that I will never, ever sell it to you. I know what you've said. I don't know that I believe it. Believe it. Dante set down his espresso cup and leaned forward. Ms. Ferraro, I'm a businessman, a successful one, and the first rule of business is that everyone has a price. Maybe yours is higher than I initially estimated. Fine. Name your number. Elena laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, entirely without humor. You think this is about money? Everything is about money. That's a depressing worldview. It's a realistic one. Elena shook her head slowly. You really don't understand, do you? You come in here with your expensive suit and your fancy car, and you think you can buy anything, anyone. But there are things in this world that can't be bought, Mr. Cavallo. Things like history, like family, like home. Those are lovely sentiments. They won't pay your bills. My bills are paid. Her voice sharpened. My restaurant is profitable. My customers are loyal. I don't need your money. Dante reached into his jacket and pulled out his checkbook. He placed it on the table between them, a gesture he had made many times before. Usually this was the turning point. Usually this was when people's principles became flexible, when their noble speeches gave way to practical considerations. $5 million, he said. For a building that's worth at most $800,000. For a business that nets you what? $100,000 a year? If you're lucky? Elena's expression didn't change. You could offer me $50 million. The answer would still be no. Why? Because this isn't just a business to me. It's my family's legacy. It's everything my grandmother worked for. Everything my mother sacrificed for. Every meal I serve is a connection to them, to our history, to who we are. She leaned forward, her dark eyes intense. You want to tear all that down to build condos for rich people who will never know or care about the families who used to live here, and you expect me to help you do it for money? I expect you to be rational. I am being rational. My rationality just includes values that you can't put in a spreadsheet. Dante studied her across the table. In the harsh fluorescent light of the kitchen, he could see the lines of fatigue around her eyes, the calluses on her hands, the small burns and scars that marked her as someone who worked with fire and knives every day. She was not a beautiful woman in the conventional sense, not polished or glamorous or refined, but there was something compelling about her, something that made him want to keep looking. You understand what you're doing, he said quietly. You understand who I am, what my family does. I know exactly who you are. And you're not afraid? Elena picked up her espresso and took a slow sip before answering. I've been afraid every day of my life, Mr. Cavallo. Afraid the restaurant would fail. Afraid I would let my mother down. Afraid I wouldn't be good enough to carry on my grandmother's legacy. She set down the cup. But I'm not afraid of you. You're just a man with money. I've faced worse. Have you? Something flickered in her eyes, there and gone before he could identify it. That's none of your business. Dante was quiet for a moment. He had expected this meeting to go differently. He had expected her to bluster, to negotiate, to eventually name a price that would allow her to save face while taking his money. That was how these things usually went. But Elena Ferraro was not following the script. He put his checkbook away. Then, what do you want? He asked. The question hung in the air between them. Elena's expression shifted, the hard edges softening slightly into something more complex. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was different, lower and more serious. Do you know what happened to my father? Dante knew, of course he knew, it was in the file, but he sensed that she needed to say it, so he remained silent. He was a good man, Elena continued, a hard worker. He drove a delivery truck for a living, spent his days hauling produce around the city. He wanted to give us a better life, wanted to buy my mother a house, wanted to send me to college. So when someone offered him a way to make extra money, he took it. He borrowed from my family. He didn't know it was your family, not at first. The man who approached him seemed legitimate, just a businessman offering loans to working people. Elena's voice was steady, but Dante could see the tension in her jaw, the tightness of her hands around her coffee cup. By the time he understood what he'd gotten into, it was too late. The interest kept growing. He couldn't pay. I know what happened next. Do you? Elena looked at him directly. Your father sent men to collect. When my father couldn't pay, they beat him. Not enough to kill him, just enough to make a point. He had broken ribs, a fractured skull, internal bleeding. He spent 2 months in the hospital. I'm sorry. Are you? The question was sharp. He never fully recovered. The head injury affected his memory, his coordination. He couldn't work anymore, couldn't drive, couldn't do much of anything except sit by the window and watch the world go by. She paused. He died when I was 16. The doctor said it was a stroke, but we knew the truth. Your family killed him. It just took them 3 years to finish the job. Dante absorbed this in silence. He had known about Marco Ferraro's debt, about the collection action his father had ordered, but the file had contained only numbers, not the human story behind them. He had not known about the brain damage, the years of suffering, the slow decline. My mother never recovered either, Elena continued. She worked 16-hour days to keep this restaurant open, to pay the bills, to give me some kind of future. She drove herself into the ground. By the time I came back from culinary school to help her, she was already sick. Heart failure, she died in this kitchen, right where you're sitting now. She gestured toward the stove, and Dante felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. So no, Mr. Cavallo, I will not sell this restaurant to you. I will not help you tear down this neighborhood that my family has been part of for 60 years, and I will not take money from the son of the man who destroyed my father. She stood up, pushing her chair back. We're done here. Dante remained seated. His mind was racing, processing this new information, recalculating his approach. He was not accustomed to losing, but he was beginning to realize that this was not a negotiation he could win through conventional means. What if I could give you something else? He asked. Elena paused, her hand on the kitchen door. There's nothing you could give me. Are you sure about that? She turned back to face him, her expression wary. What are you talking about? Dante stood slowly, buttoning his jacket. He walked toward her, stopping a few feet away, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. I can't undo what my father did to your family. I can't bring your parents back. But there are other debts, other families who have suffered because of the Cavallos. He paused, choosing his words carefully. What if I could make some of that right? Elena's eyes narrowed. I don't understand. Neither do I, not yet. Dante moved past her, pushing open the kitchen door. But I'm beginning to think that this conversation isn't over. He walked through the empty dining room, past the stacked chairs and bare tables toward the front door. Behind him, he heard Elena following. Mr. Cavallo. He stopped, his hand on the door handle, and turned. Elena stood in the middle of her grandmother's restaurant, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Why are you really here? It was a good question. Dante had asked himself the same thing as he sat in his office, waiting for 11 o'clock to arrive. He could have sent a lawyer. He could have sent his second in command. He could have simply waited, applying pressure through other channels until she was forced to sell. But instead, he had come himself. And standing here now, looking at this woman who had refused to be bought, he thought he was beginning to understand why. I don't know, he admitted, but I think I need to find out. He opened the door and stepped into the night. The next morning, Dante canceled his meetings. This was unprecedented. In 20 years of running the family business, Dante had never canceled a meeting. He had attended meetings with the flu, with broken bones, with fresh stitches from an unfortunate incident that he preferred not to think about. Meetings were where deals were made, where power was exercised, where the empire was maintained and expanded. But today he sat in his private study in the family estate outside the city, surrounded by boxes of files that his assistants had spent the night retrieving from storage. The files documented 30 years of the Cavallo family's lending operations, one of their most profitable and most brutal enterprises. His father had run it with an iron fist, extending credit to working-class families at interest rates that made repayment nearly impossible, then collecting through intimidation and violence when payments were missed. Dante had always known about this business in the abstract. He had inherited it along with everything else when his father died. But he had never looked closely at the individual cases, the names and faces, and stories behind the numbers. Now he looked. Marco Ferraro's file was thin, just a few pages documenting a loan of $15,000 taken out 20 years ago. The interest rate was 25%, compounded monthly. Within a year, the debt had grown to $40,000. Within 2 years, it was over $100,000, more than Marco could ever hope to repay. The collection notes were clinical, businesslike. First warning delivered on such and such date. Second warning delivered. Physical collection action authorized and executed. Subject hospitalized. Debt marked as uncollectible. Case closed. Case closed. As if Marco Ferraro's destroyed life was simply a bookkeeping matter. Dante read through dozens more files, each one documenting a similar story. A struggling family, a desperate decision, an impossible debt, and then the violence, the hospitals, the broken bones, and broken lives. He had known, of course. On some level, he had always known. But knowing in the abstract was different from reading the names, seeing the photographs, understanding that each file represented a human being whose life had been damaged or destroyed by his family's greed. By late afternoon, Dante felt sick. He pushed the files away and walked to the window, staring out at the manicured grounds of the estate. The gardens were beautiful, maintained by a staff of professionals who ensured that every flower bloomed at the appropriate time. Every hedge was trimmed to perfection. It was a long way from the cramped apartments of the Bellavia neighborhood, from the struggling families who had borrowed money from the Cavallos and paid for it with their blood. His phone buzzed. A message from Paolo. The Ferraro woman is asking questions. She went to see Father Dominic at St. Catherine's this morning. Dante frowned. Father Dominic was an elderly priest who had served the Bellavia neighborhood for decades. He knew everyone, heard every confession, understood the community's secrets and sorrows better than anyone. If Elena was talking to Father Dominic, she was investigating the Cavallos, looking for information, trying to understand what she was up against. Smart, Dante thought. Dangerous, but smart. He picked up his phone and dialed. Paolo, I need you to arrange a meeting. Someone who can tell me about the old days, about how my father ran things. Who did you have in mind, sir? Dante thought for a moment. Sal Benedetto. He was my father's right hand before he retired. He knows where all the bodies are buried. Literally or figuratively, sir? Both, probably. Find him. Sal Benedetto lived in a modest house in the suburbs, a far cry from the luxury he had enjoyed during his years with the Cavallo organization. He was 72 now, with thinning gray hair and a belly that strained against his cardigan, but his eyes were still sharp, still watchful, the eyes of a man who had survived in a dangerous world by paying attention. He received Dante in his living room, which was decorated with religious iconography and photographs of grandchildren. A television played in the corner, some game show with the volume turned low. The room smelled of coffee and old cigarettes. Young Dante, Sal said, easing himself into a worn armchair. It's been a long time. 5 years since my father's funeral. Has it? Time moves differently when you're old. Sal gestured to a seat on the sofa. Sit, sit. Maria will bring coffee. Dante sat. A moment later, a small woman with gray hair appeared with a tray bearing 2 cups and a plate of biscotti. She set it down without speaking and retreated to another room. My wife, Sal said unnecessarily. She doesn't like visitors from the old days. Makes her nervous. I won't stay long. No, I imagine you won't. Men like you are always busy. Sal picked up his coffee and took a sip. So, what brings the great Dante Cavallo to my little house? Dante considered how to approach this. Sal had been his father's most trusted advisor, his enforcer, his confessor. If anyone knew the truth about the Cavallo family's operations, it was this man. I've been reviewing some old files, Dante said carefully, from the lending business. Sal's expression didn't change. Have you? I want to understand how things worked, back then. Things worked the way they always work. People borrowed money they couldn't afford. We collected one way or another. Sal shrugged. It wasn't pretty, but it was business. There's a family named Ferraro. The father borrowed $15,000 20 years ago. For the first time, something flickered in Sal's eyes. Marco Ferraro, the truck driver. You remember him? I remember everyone. Your father used to say I had a mind like a filing cabinet. Sal set down his coffee cup. Ferraro was a stubborn one. Wouldn't pay, wouldn't negotiate, kept insisting he'd been tricked into the loan, which he had been, of course, but that wasn't the point. The point was that he owed us money. What happened to him? Sal was quiet for a moment, studying Dante with those sharp old eyes. You know what happened. It's in the file. I want to hear it from you. Why? It was a reasonable question. Dante wasn't entirely sure of the answer himself. He only knew that reading the files hadn't been enough. that he needed to understand not just what had happened, but why and how and what it had meant to the men who had carried out his father's orders. "Because I'm trying to decide what kind of man I want to be," Dante said finally, "and I need to understand what kind of man my father was." Sal was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, heavier somehow. "Your father was a hard man. He believed that mercy was weakness, that examples had to be made, that fear was the only language people truly understood." Sal paused. "I didn't always agree with his methods, but I followed orders. That was my job." "What happened with Ferraro?" "He was supposed to be a simple collection. Rough him up a little, remind him of his obligations, maybe break a finger or two. Standard procedure." Sal shook his head. "But the boys your father sent, they got carried away. Beat him half to death. Your father was furious, not because of the beating, but because it looked bad. Made us look out of control. And after that, nothing. Ferraro was destroyed. Couldn't work, couldn't think straight. His family scraped by however they could. We wrote off the debt, moved on to other things." Sal picked up his coffee again, hands trembling slightly. "That's the business, Dante. You break people, and then you forget about them." Dante absorbed this in silence. He thought of Elena Ferraro, standing in her grandmother's kitchen, telling him about her father's slow decline, her mother's early death. He thought of the file on Marco Ferraro, so thin, so clinical, as if a man's life could be reduced to a few pages of numbers. Were there others like him? Dante asked. Others who were destroyed because of debts to our family? Sal laughed, but there was no humor in it. There were hundreds, Dante. Thousands, maybe, over the years. Your grandfather started it, your father perfected it, and now you've inherited it all. He leaned forward, his old eyes boring into Dante's. "Why are you asking these questions? What do you want?" "I want to make it right." The words surprised Dante as much as they surprised Sal. He hadn't planned to say them, hadn't even consciously thought them. But as soon as they were out, he knew they were true. Sal stared at him for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly. "You can't make it right. You can't undo what's been done. The people we hurt are dead or broken or scattered. The damage is permanent." "Maybe, but I can try." Sal finished his coffee and set down the cup with a decisive click. "You're a fool, Dante. A well-meaning fool, maybe, but a fool nonetheless. Your father would be rolling in his grave." "Good," Dante said, standing. "That's exactly what I want." He left Sal Benedetto sitting in his living room, surrounded by photographs of grandchildren who would never know what their grandfather had done in his younger days. As he walked to his car, Dante felt something shifting inside him, some foundation cracking, some wall beginning to crumble. He didn't know yet what he was going to do. He only knew that he couldn't continue as he had been, building his empire on the suffering of others, pretending that the sins of his father were not also his own. He pulled out his phone and dialed. "Paolo, cancel the Bellavia project." There was a long pause. "Sir?" "You heard me. Cancel it. All of it. Contact the property owners we've bought out and offer to sell back to them at cost. Anyone who wants to return, we make it easy. Sir, with respect, that represents tens of millions of dollars in investments." "I know what it represents. Do it anyway." He hung up before Paolo could argue further. Then he got in his car and drove back toward the city, toward the Bellavia neighborhood, toward a small restaurant with a faded sign and a woman who had refused to be bought. Elena was making pasta when Dante walked into the kitchen. It was early evening, still a few hours before the dinner service would begin. The restaurant's front door had been unlocked, the dining room empty, and Dante had simply walked through, past the bare tables and stacked chairs, through the swinging door into the kitchen. Elena stood at a large wooden table, flour dusted across its surface, her hands working a ball of dough with practiced efficiency. She looked up when he entered, and her expression shifted from surprise to wariness. "We're not open yet." "I know. I'm not here to eat." She continued working the dough, her movements rhythmic and sure. "Then why are you here?" Dante pulled out a chair from the small table in the corner and sat down, uninvited. He watched her hands, the way they stretched and folded the dough, creating something from basic ingredients through skill and patience. "I've canceled the Bellavia project," he said. Elena's hand stopped moving. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "The development, the condos, it's over. I'm selling the properties back to the original owners." Dante paused. including the ones on your block. Why? Because you were right. Elena wiped her hands on her apron and leaned against the table, arms crossed. Right about what? About everything. About the neighborhood, about the families, about what my family has done to people. Dante looked down at his hands, at the expensive watch on his wrist, at the signs of his wealth and privilege. I spent yesterday reading files. Old files from my father's time. Records of every loan he made, every family he destroyed. Including mine. Including yours. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic from the street outside. Elena watched him with those dark eyes, and Dante had the sense that she was seeing more than he intended to show. What do you want me to say? She asked finally. That I forgive you? That all is forgiven because you canceled a real estate project? No, I don't expect forgiveness. Then what do you want? Dante thought about this question. What did he want? He had money beyond imagination, power beyond measure, a name that opened every door and commanded respect and fear. He had everything, and yet, sitting in this modest kitchen, watching this woman make pasta, he felt that he had nothing at all. I want to make amends, he said. I know I can't undo the past. I can't bring back your father or heal your mother's heart, but I can try to do better. I can try to be better. Elena's expression softened slightly, though her posture remained guarded. And how do you plan to do that? I don't know yet. That's part of why I'm here. Dante met her eyes. You know this. Community. You know the families who've been hurt by mine. Help me understand what they need. Help me figure out how to start making things right. You want me to help you? After everything? I know it's a lot to ask. Elena laughed, a short, incredulous sound. That's an understatement. Yes, it is. She was quiet for a long moment, studying him. Dante felt exposed under her gaze, as if she could see through all his expensive clothes and practiced composure to the uncertain man beneath. My grandmother used to say something, Elena said finally. She said that a person's character isn't shown in their best moments, but in their worst. That anyone can be good when it's easy, but only the truly virtuous can be good when it costs them. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. Elena uncrossed her arms and returned to her pasta dough. She also used to say that people can change if they truly want to. Not just their behavior, but their hearts. Do you believe that? I used to. Now, I'm not so sure. She began rolling the dough into a thin sheet, her movements precise and efficient. People like you, people who have had power their whole lives, they don't usually change. They can't. The power corrupts them too deeply. I'd like to prove you wrong. Elena glanced at him, a flicker of something unidentifiable in her eyes. We'll see. She continued working in silence, and Dante watched her. He had never seen anyone make pasta by hand before, not like this, not with such skill and care. The dough transformed under her hands, becoming thin and delicate, almost translucent. How long have you been doing this? He asked. Making pasta, since I was a child. My grandmother started teaching me as soon as I could reach the table. Elena smiled slightly, the first smile Dante had seen from her. She used to say that pasta is the heart of Italian cooking. Get the pasta right and everything else follows. Is it hard to learn? Not hard, but it takes practice, patience. She glanced at him, neither of which I expect you have much of. You might be surprised. Elena finished rolling the dough and began cutting it into long strips with a sharp knife. Why did you really come here today? The truth. Dante considered the question. He could give her the answer he had already given about making amends and doing better. It was true, as far as it went, but it wasn't the whole truth. I couldn't stop thinking about you, he admitted, about this place, about what you said, about things that can't be bought. And what conclusion did you reach? That I've been buying everything my whole life, and that maybe some of the most important things aren't for sale. Elena set down her knife and looked at him directly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. I don't trust you, she said finally. I probably never will, not completely. Not after what your family did to mine. I understand, but she paused, as if considering whether to continue. I'm willing to give you a chance to prove yourself, a small chance. What would that look like? You said you wanted to understand what the community needs? Fine. There's a meeting at St. Catherine's tomorrow night. Local business owners, community leaders, people who have lived in this neighborhood for generations. They've been organizing against your development project for months. You want me to attend? I want you to listen. Really listen, not just pretend while you wait for your turn to speak. Elena's eyes were fierce. These are good people, Mr. Cavallo. Hardworking, honest, decent people. They've been fighting to save their neighborhood from people like you. The least you can do is hear what they have to say. Dante nodded slowly. I'll be there. And Dante? She used his first name for the first time, and he felt something shift at the sound of it. Don't wear a $10,000 suit. These people will eat you alive. Despite everything, he smiled. I'll keep that in mind. He stood. To leave, then paused. The pasta you're making, what dish is it for? Pappardelle with wild boar ragout. It's my grandmother's recipe. Is it good? Elena raised an eyebrow. I don't make anything that isn't good. Maybe I'll come try it sometime, as a customer. Maybe you will. She turned back to her work, dismissing him. Tomorrow night. St. Catherine's, 7 o'clock. Don't be late. Dante walked out through the empty restaurant into the warm afternoon sun. As he stood on the sidewalk, looking at the old buildings and neighborhood shops, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. St. Catherine's Church was a beautiful old building, its stone facade darkened by decades of city grime, its stained glass windows glowing with the last light of the setting sun. Dante climbed the worn steps and pulled open the heavy wooden door, stepping into the cool darkness of the vestibule. The meeting was in the parish hall, a large room in the basement where generations of neighborhood children had attended Sunday school, where weddings and funerals had been celebrated, where the community gathered in times of joy and crisis. Tonight, it was packed. Dante had taken Elena's advice about the suit. He wore simple dark jeans, a plain button-down shirt, and a jacket that cost only slightly more than a normal person might pay. He had left his expensive watch at home, replacing it with a simple Timex. He wanted to blend in, to be unremarkable, though he suspected he would fail. He slipped into the back of the room and found a seat in the last row of folding chairs. The hall was arranged for a meeting, with rows of chairs facing a small stage where a table had been set up with microphones. Maybe 70 or 80 people filled the seats, a mix of ages and backgrounds united by their connection to this neighborhood. Father Dominic stood at the microphone, a slight man in his 70s with a kind face and a shock of white hair. He was welcoming the attendees, thanking them for coming, explaining the purpose of the meeting. As many of you know, he said, his voice carrying easily through the hall, we have been fighting the Cavallo Development Project for almost 2 years. We have attended city council meetings, we have organized protests, we have done everything in our power to make our voices heard. There were murmurs from the audience, sounds of agreement and frustration. Today, we received some unexpected news. Father Dominic paused, and Dante saw him glance toward the back of the room, toward where Dante sat in the shadows. The development project has been canceled. The Cavallo organization is offering to sell back the properties they have purchased at original prices. The room erupted. People turned to their neighbors, exclaiming, questioning, expressing disbelief. Dante heard snatches of conversation. Is it true? What's the catch? I don't believe it. Father Dominic raised his hands for quiet. I know this is unexpected. I know many of you are skeptical, but I have confirmed the news with multiple sources. The project is over. An older woman near the front stood up, her voice sharp. Why? Why would Cavallo give up? He's not the kind of man who surrenders. That's a good question, Mrs. Benedetti, and I believe we have someone here who can answer it. Father Dominic looked directly at Dante. Mr. Cavallo, would you like to address the community? Every head in the room turned. Dante felt the weight of their stares, the suspicion, the hostility, the fear. These were people who had spent their lives in the shadow of his family's power, who had watched neighbors destroyed by loans they couldn't repay, who had every reason to hate the Cavallo name. He stood slowly and made his way to the front of the room. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the shuffle of his footsteps on the wooden floor. When he reached the stage, he turned to face the crowd. He found Elena in the third row. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and wariness. Their eyes met, and she gave him the smallest nod. Dante took a breath. My name is Dante Cavallo, he began. Most of you know who I am, or at least who my family is. You know what we've done to this community, the loans, the collections, the families we've destroyed. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. I'm not here to make excuses. I'm not here to justify what my father did or my grandfather. What they did was wrong. I know that now in a way I didn't before. So what changed? The question came from a man in the middle of the room, his voice hard with skepticism. Dante looked at him directly. I met someone who refused to be bought, someone who forced me to see what I had been blind to my whole life, the human cost of our business, the suffering behind the numbers in our files. His eyes found Elena again. She didn't look away. I spent the last few days reading through old records, loan documents, collection reports, hundreds of families who came to us when they were desperate, who trusted us to help them, and who we destroyed instead. Dante's voice caught slightly. My father used to say that business was business, that you couldn't let sentiment interfere with profit. I accepted that. I never questioned it, and because of that, I'm complicit in everything he did. The room was silent. Dante could feel the weight of their attention, their judgment, their pain. I can't undo the past. I can't bring back the people we've hurt, but I can try to do better. That's why I canceled the development project. That's why I'm offering to sell back the properties we've purchased. And that's why I'm here tonight to ask what else I can do. He stopped speaking and waited. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Mrs. Benedetti stood again. She was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, with white hair and a face lined by decades of hard work. Her eyes were fierce. My husband borrowed from your family 30 years ago. When he couldn't pay, your father's men beat him so badly he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. He died 5 years ago, still afraid that someone would come for him again. Dante met her eyes. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't bring him back. Sorry doesn't give me back the man I married. No, it doesn't. Other voices joined in now, a chorus of pain and anger. A man whose brother had been crippled. A woman whose parents had lost their home. A young man whose grandfather had committed suicide rather than face the Cavallo's collectors. Story after story, each one a testament to the suffering his family had caused. Dante listened to all of it. He didn't defend himself, didn't make excuses, didn't try to shift blame. He simply stood there and received their anger like a penance. When the voices finally quieted, Father Dominic stepped forward. Mr. Cavallo has offered to establish a fund for the community. A fund to help families affected by his family's business, to pay for education, healthcare, housing, to try to repair some of the damage. How much? Someone asked. $20 million to start. More if needed. A ripple of shock went through the room. $20 million was more money than most of these families would see in a lifetime. It's not enough, Dante said quietly. Nothing will ever be enough, but it's a start. Elena stood. All eyes turned to her. This woman who had lived in the neighborhood her whole life, who had refused to sell her grandmother's restaurant, who had somehow reached Dante Cavallo when no one else could. I didn't ask him to do this, she said. I didn't believe he was capable of change. Part of me still doesn't. She looked at Dante. But I've seen something in him these past few days, a willingness to listen, to learn, to admit that he was wrong. She turned to face the community. That doesn't mean we should trust him. Trust has to be earned over years through actions, not words. But I think we should give him a chance, not for his sake, but for ours. She paused. We've been fighting the Cavallos for generations. Maybe it's time to try something different. The meeting continued for another 2 hours. People asked questions, raised concerns, expressed doubts. Dante answered as honestly as he could, promising nothing he couldn't deliver, admitting uncertainty where it existed. By the end, there was no consensus, no warm embrace, no forgiveness. But there was something, a crack in the wall, a possibility that hadn't existed before. As the crowd dispersed, Elena approached Dante. You did well, she said. Better than I expected. That's a low bar. Yes, it is. She almost smiled. Come to the restaurant tomorrow. I'll cook for you. The pappardelle with wild boar ragout? We'll see. It depends on whether you can behave yourself. She walked away before he could respond, disappearing into the crowd of departing neighbors. Dante stood alone in the emptying hall, surrounded by folding chairs and the lingering echoes of old grief. He had a long way to go. Years of work, probably. Decades of proving himself. And even then, many in this community would never trust him, never forgive him, never see him as anything but the son of the man who had destroyed their families. But it was a start. The next evening, Dante arrived at Nona's table at closing time. The last diners were paying their checks, gathering their coats, complimenting the waiter on another wonderful meal. Dante waited outside until the restaurant was empty, watching through the window as Elena moved through the dining room, blowing out candles and straightening chairs. When the last customer had gone, she opened the door and gestured him inside. "You came. You invited me. I half expected you to send an assistant." Dante smiled slightly. "I don't have assistants for this kind of thing." Elena led him through the dining room into the kitchen. It was different tonight, warmer and more intimate. The harsh fluorescent lights had been replaced by softer lamps, and the stainless steel surfaces gleamed in the golden glow. A pot simmered on the stove, filling the air with an aroma that made Dante's stomach growl. "Sit," Elena said, pointing to the small table in the corner, "and stay out of my way." Dante sat and watched her work. She moved through the kitchen with the confidence of someone who had spent years mastering this space, gathering ingredients, adjusting heat, tasting and seasoning with quick, precise movements. Her hands never stopped, yet there was a grace to her actions that made it look effortless. "The meeting last night," Elena said without turning around, "it made an impression." "On who?" "On everyone. Mrs. Benedetti called me this morning. She said she's never seen anyone stand there and take what you took without trying to defend themselves." There was nothing to defend. Most people in your position would have argued, made excuses, blamed their predecessors. Elena glanced at him over her shoulder. "You didn't." What would have been the point? She returned to her cooking, stirring the pot on the stove. The point is that people noticed. They're not ready to trust you, not by a long shot, but they're willing to watch, to see what you do next. That's more than I expected. That's more than you deserve. There was no malice in her voice, just honesty. But the neighborhood needs help and you're offering it. People are pragmatic. They'll take your money even if they don't like you. And you? Will you take my money? Elena turned off the heat under the pot and carried it to the counter where 2 plates waited. She ladled out portions of the ragu, the rich sauce thick with shredded meat and fragrant with herbs. "The restaurant isn't part of the fund. I told you before, I'm not for sale." "That's not what I asked." Elena set a plate in front of him. The pasta was perfect, wide ribbons of pappardelle draped in the dark, meaty sauce. Steam rose from it, carrying the scent of wine and rosemary and something Dante couldn't identify. "What did you ask?" "Whether you'll accept help, for yourself, not just the community." Elena sat across from him with her own plate. She picked up a fork but didn't eat, just watched him with those dark, evaluating eyes. "I've been taking care of myself since I was 16 years old. I've never asked anyone for anything. I know. I don't know how to accept help. It doesn't feel natural to me." "I understand." Dante picked up his fork and twirled it in the pasta. "For what it's worth, I don't know how to give it. Not really. I've spent my whole life taking things, not giving them." "Then we're both learning something new." They ate in silence for a few minutes. The ragu was extraordinary, rich and complex, the meat falling apart at the touch of a fork, the sauce coating each strand of pasta with flavor. "This is incredible," Dante said. "It's my grandmother's recipe. She learned to make it in Tuscany during the war. Wild boar was one of the few meats available." Elena took a bite of her own pasta. She used to say that necessity is the mother of invention, and also the mother of really good cooking. She sounds like an amazing woman. She was. Strong, stubborn, impossible sometimes. Elena smiled, the expression transforming her face. "She would have hated you, by the way." "I would have expected nothing less." Elena laughed, a real laugh this time, and Dante felt something shift in his chest. He had heard her laugh before, but only with scorn or disbelief. This was different. This was the laugh of someone who was, against all odds, enjoying his company. "Why did you really come back?" Elena asked, setting down her fork. "After that first night, after I told you about my father, about everything, you could have found another way to handle the development project, lawyers, pressure, whatever. Instead, you showed up at that meeting. You let people yell at you for 2 hours. Why?" Dante considered the question. He had asked himself the same thing, and the answers he found were complicated. "Because you made me see something I hadn't seen before. The real cost of what my family does. The people behind the numbers." He paused. and because I wanted to prove that I could be different, that I wasn't just my father's son. And now? Now I'm not sure. I've spent the last few days questioning everything I thought I knew about my family, my business, my life. He met her eyes. About myself. Elena held his gaze for a long moment. Dante had the feeling of being measured, weighed, evaluated on criteria he couldn't see. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. "Is that good or bad?" "I haven't decided yet." She picked up her fork again and resumed eating. "But ask me again in a few months." They finished their meal, talking about lighter things. Elena's years training in Italy, the restaurants she had worked in, the chefs who had mentored her, the moment she knew she had to come home and take over her grandmother's legacy. Dante told her about his own past, the pressure of being the Cavallo heir, the expectations that had shaped his life since childhood. He had never spoken this openly with anyone, never admitted the doubts and fears that lurked beneath his confident exterior. By the time the plates were empty and the kitchen cleaned, something had changed between them. They were not friends, not yet. The history between their families was too dark for easy friendship, but they were no longer enemies either. They were something else, something that didn't yet have a name. "Thank you for dinner," Dante said as Elena walked him to the door. "It was the best meal I've had in years." "It was just pasta." "No, it wasn't." Elena opened the door, and the cool night air rushed in. The street was quiet, the neighborhood settling into sleep. "Good night, Dante." "Good night, Elena." He stepped outside, then turned back. "The fund, the community work. I'm going to need help figuring out how to do it right. Someone who knows the neighborhood, knows the families, can tell me what's really needed. Are you offering me a job? I'm asking for your help." Elena leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "And what do I get out of it? The satisfaction of watching a Cavallo take orders from a Ferraro?" She almost smiled. "That is tempting. Will you at least think about it?" "I'll think about it." She started to close the door, then paused. "Dante, the ribollita, my grandmother's recipe. I'm making it tomorrow. If you want to learn, be here at 4 a.m. 4 a.m? That's when the day starts in a restaurant. Is that a problem?" Dante thought about his life, his schedule, his habits. He had never voluntarily woken before dawn for anything. "No, it's not a problem. Then I'll see you tomorrow." She closed the door, and Dante stood on the empty street looking at the faded sign above the restaurant. Nona's Table, a place that had survived wars and poverty and the cruelty of his own family. A place that was still standing, still serving food, still keeping memories alive. He had never believed in redemption. He had always thought that the past was permanent, that sins could never be washed away, but standing here, in this neighborhood that his family had tried to destroy, he felt something that might have been hope. It would take time, years probably, and he might fail. But for the first time in his life, Dante Cavallo wanted to try. The alarm went off at 3:30 in the morning. Dante had set 2, plus arranged for Paolo to call him, paranoid about oversleeping. He needn't have worried. He had barely slept at all, his mind too full of questions and possibilities. He showered, dressed in simple clothes, and drove his own car to the restaurant. It felt strange, driving himself. Normally, Paolo handled everything, but this felt like something he should do alone. The street was dark and empty when he arrived, the only light coming from the windows of Nona's Table. He could see Elena moving inside, already at work. The door was unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped into warmth and the smell of coffee. "You came!" Elena stood behind the counter, filling 2 cups from an ancient espresso machine. "I wasn't sure you would." "I said I would." People say a lot of things they don't mean. Dante accepted the cup she offered him. The espresso was strong and bitter, exactly what he needed after a sleepless night. "Where do we start?" he asked. "First, we wash our hands. Then we put on aprons. Then I give you a lot of instructions that you probably won't remember." Elena handed him a white apron. "Cooking is like anything else. You learn by doing, not by talking about it." For the next 2 hours, Dante learned to make ribollita. It was harder than it looked. The soup was deceptively simple, just bread and vegetables and beans. But every step required attention. The vegetables had to be cut precisely. The beans had to be cooked until they were tender but not mushy. The bread had to be stale but not too stale. The layering had to be done just so. Elena was a patient teacher, but demanding. She corrected his knife technique, adjusted his seasoning, made him redo things that didn't meet her standards. "Your grandmother would be horrified," she said at one point, looking at his misshapen carrot chunks. "I'm doing my best." Your best isn't good enough. Do it again. He did it again, and eventually he started to get it right. By the time the sun rose, the ribollita was in the oven, a thick, fragrant mass of vegetables and bread that would finish cooking into something greater than the sum of its parts. Now we wait, Elena said, wiping down the counter. Cooking is mostly waiting. They sat at the small table with fresh cups of espresso. Dante's hands were sore, his back ached from standing, and he had a small burn on his forearm from brushing against a hot pan. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so satisfied. "Thank you for teaching me," he said. "Thank me after you taste it. If it's terrible, you're starting over. And if it's good, then maybe there's hope for you yet." They were quiet for a moment, watching the morning light creep through the kitchen windows. "I've been thinking about your offer," Elena said. "The community work, the fund. And I'll do it. Not for you and not for money. I'll do it because these are my people, my neighbors, my family's community for 3 generations. If there's a chance to help them, I have to take it. Even if it means working with a cavallo? Even then." She looked at him directly. "But I have conditions." "Name them." "First, no strings attached. I work with you, not for you. I give advice, you listen to it. If I say something's a bad idea, you stop and consider that maybe you're wrong." "Fair enough." "Second, the fund is controlled by a community board, people from the neighborhood, not your lawyers and accountants. They decide how the money is spent." "That's reasonable." "Third," she paused, "you keep coming to these lessons. Once a week at least. You learn to cook properly, the way my grandmother would have wanted." Dante raised an eyebrow. "That's a condition?" "Yes." "Why?" Elena was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "Because cooking teaches you things that money can't buy. Patience, attention, respect for ingredients and traditions. You want to change, you want to be different from your father. This is how you start." Dante thought about this. It was an unusual condition, maybe even a strange one, but there was wisdom in it too. His father had never cooked a meal in his life, had never made anything with his own hands. He had only taken, never created. "I accept your conditions." "All of them." "All of them." Elena nodded slowly. "Then we have a deal." She stood and checked on the ribollita, opening the oven door to release a cloud of fragrant steam. The soup had darkened and thickened, the bread soaking up the broth, the vegetables melding together into something rich and unified. "It's ready," she said. "Get 2 bowls from that cabinet." Dante found the bowls and brought them to the counter. Elena ladled out generous portions of the ribollita, the soup steaming and dense and beautiful. They sat down to eat. Dante took his first bite and closed his eyes. It was extraordinary, simple and complex at the same time, the flavors layered and harmonious. He could taste the tomatoes and the beans, the bread and the olive oil, but they had all combined into something new, something that transcended its humble ingredients. "My grandmother used to say that ribollita is a metaphor for life," Elena said, watching him eat. "You take whatever you have, you put it together with care, and you let time do the rest. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive, just patience. And attention and love." She was a philosopher. She was a cook, which is the same thing sometimes. Elena took a bite of her own soup. The word ribollita means reboiled. It's a dish made from leftovers, from things that might otherwise be thrown away. But treated with respect, those leftover things become something wonderful. Dante understood what she was saying. He was a leftover of sorts, the product of a family that had destroyed as much as it had built. But maybe, with patience and attention, he could become something different, something better. "Tell me more about your grandmother," he said. And Elena did. She told him about Rosa Ferraro, who had survived the war by sheer stubbornness, who had immigrated to America with nothing and built a life through hard work and determination. She told him about her mother, Lucia, who had inherited Rosa's work ethic and her recipes, but also her tendency to sacrifice herself for others. She told him about her father, Marco, who had been kind and gentle and completely unprepared for the world he found himself in. In return, Dante told her about his own family, his grandfather, who had started with nothing and built an empire through ruthlessness and cunning, his father, who had expanded that empire through fear and violence, and himself, who had inherited everything and questioned nothing until now. They talked for hours, long past when the ribollita bowls were empty, long past when the kitchen should have been prepared for the day's cooking. The morning light grew stronger through the windows, and still they talked. By the time Elena finally looked at the clock and exclaimed about the time, something had changed between them. The wariness was still there, the history too dark to forget, but there was something else now too. Understanding maybe, or the beginning of it. "You need to go," Elena said, standing. "I have a restaurant to run." "And I have a foundation to establish." Dante stood too, suddenly, reluctant to leave. "When do you want to start working on the community board?" "Come back tomorrow. We'll make a list of people to approach." She hesitated. "And bring work clothes. If you're going to be in my kitchen, you're going to help." Dante smiled. "I thought I was the boss." "In your world, maybe. In my kitchen, I'm the boss." She handed him a container of leftover ribollita. "Here, you'll want this later." "Thank you for everything." Elena nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Don't thank me yet. We have a long way to go." Dante walked out into the bright morning, the container of soup warm in his hands. The street was coming to life now. Shopkeepers opening their doors, children heading to school, the ordinary rhythms of a neighborhood that had survived despite everything. His phone buzzed, Paolo asking if he needed anything. Meetings to reschedule, decisions to make. He ignored it all. For this moment, he just wanted to stand in the sunshine and hold a container of soup made from leftovers and love. For the first time in his life, Dante Cavallo felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The months that followed were the hardest of Dante's life, and also, somehow, the best. The Community Foundation was established with a board of 12 members, all residents of the Bellavia neighborhood. Mrs. Benedetti was elected chair, her fierce energy channeled into rebuilding rather than fighting. Father Dominic served as spiritual advisor, his quiet wisdom guiding the board through difficult decisions. Dante attended every meeting but rarely spoke. He listened, as Elena had demanded. He learned about problems he had never imagined, needs that no amount of money could simply solve. Housing for elderly residents who couldn't climb stairs anymore, health care for families without insurance, education for children who had fallen behind, job training for workers displaced by changing industries. The fund helped where it could. Dante added more money. As needed, his accountants increasingly alarmed by his philanthropy. He didn't care. For the first time, he was using his wealth for something meaningful. But money was only part of it. The harder work was showing up. Week after week, month after month, Dante appeared in the Bellavia neighborhood. He attended community events. He sat in church basements and school gymnasiums listening to people talk about their struggles and dreams. He visited families who had been hurt by his father, sitting in their living rooms and hearing their stories without defense or excuse. Not everyone accepted him. Some never would. Mrs. Benedetti's son refused to shake his hand, would leave any room Dante entered. Others crossed the street to avoid him or muttered curses when he passed. He accepted this as his due, but slowly, grudgingly, some began to see him differently. Not as a friend, not as one of their own, but as someone who was at least trying, someone who showed up and did the work. And through it all, there was Elena. Every week, as promised, Dante came to her kitchen before dawn. He learned to make pasta and sauces, soups and stews, all the dishes her grandmother had passed down. His knife skills improved, his palate developed. He began to understand the subtle chemistry of cooking, the way heat transformed ingredients, the importance of timing and patience. Elena was still demanding, still quick to criticize, still unwilling to accept anything less than her best. But she also began to share more of herself, stories about her childhood, memories of her parents, hopes and fears she had never voiced to anyone. "You're becoming a decent cook," she told him one morning, watching him plate a dish of cacio e pepe. "That might be the nicest thing you've ever said to me. Don't let it go to your head. You're still terrible at gnocchi." "I'm working on it." Elena smiled, the expression that transformed her face into something beautiful. She smiled more often now, when they were alone in the kitchen. The wariness had not disappeared entirely, but it had softened into something more like caution. "The foundation is doing good work," she said. "Mrs. Benedetti was telling me about the housing program. 3 families moved into new apartments last month. It's a start. It's more than a start." She put down her coffee cup and looked at him seriously. "The neighborhood is changing, Dante, not because of the money, but because people have hope again. They believe things can get better." "Because of the foundation?" "Because someone who had the power to destroy them chose to help them instead." She paused. That matters. More than you know. Dante absorbed this in silence. He had spent his whole life accumulating power, believing that power was the only thing that mattered. But Elena was teaching him something different. Power meant nothing without purpose. Wealth meant nothing without generosity. Success meant nothing without service. My father would think I've gone soft, he said. Your father was a monster. Yes, he was. But you're not. Elena reached across the table and touched his hand just briefly, the first time she had voluntarily touched him. You could have been. You were raised to be, but you chose differently. Because of you. No. She shook her head. I just showed you the door. You're the one who walked through it. She withdrew her hand and stood, returning to her work, but something had shifted between them, some final barrier giving way. Dante watched her move through the kitchen, this woman who had refused to be bought, who had challenged everything he thought he knew, who had somehow become the most important person in his life. He loved her. He realized it with a shock, the emotion unfamiliar and overwhelming. He had never loved anyone before, not really, not like this. But he said nothing. Some things he was learning couldn't be rushed. Some things needed time to ripen, like good wine, like relationships built on patience and attention and care. A year passed, then 2. The Bellavia neighborhood was transformed, not by demolition and development, but by investment and support. The foundation funded repairs to aging buildings, keeping their character while making them safe and comfortable. It supported local businesses, helping them compete with chain stores. It created programs for youth and seniors, for immigrants and longtime residents, for everyone who called this community home. Dante's other businesses continued, but with a different focus. He wound down the lending operations that had caused so much pain, absorbing the financial losses without complaint. He redirected resources toward legitimate enterprises, cleaning up the Cavallo empire one piece at a time. It would take years more to complete. Perhaps it would never be truly complete, but every step forward was a victory, every change a small redemption. And through it all, there was Elena. They had not named what was between them. There had been no dramatic declaration, no romantic gestures, no moment when everything became clear. Instead, their relationship had grown slowly, organically, like something planted and carefully tended. They cooked together every week, and often more than that. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. They attended community events together, worked side by side on foundation projects, shared meals that Elena had prepared. Somewhere along the way, without either of them quite noticing, they had become essential to each other. It was Elena who finally named it, on a night 2 years after their first meeting. The restaurant was closed for a private event, a celebration for the foundation's 2nd anniversary. The dining room was filled with people from the neighborhood eating food that Elena had prepared, talking and laughing and toasting to the future. Dante stood by the window, watching the crowd, feeling a peace he had never known before. These were not his people. Not. By birth or background. But they had accepted him, or at least accepted his presence, and that meant more than he could express. Elena appeared beside him, 2 glasses of wine in her hands. She offered him one and stood next to him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. You did this, she said, gesturing at the room. We did this. All of us. But it started with you, with a choice you made. Dante took a sip of his wine. It was good. A local producer that the foundation had helped establish. It started with you refusing to sell your restaurant. And you could have found other ways to force me. Pressure, intimidation, all the tools your family used for generations. I could have, but you didn't. She looked at him, her dark eyes soft in the candlelight. Why not? Dante thought about the question. He had asked himself the same thing many times over the past 2 years. Because you showed me something different. A world where people matter more than profit, where family means love, not leverage, where strength comes from service, not domination. He turned to face her. You showed me who I could be if I was brave enough to become it. Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she reached up and touched his face, her calloused fingers gentle against his cheek. I'm not for sale, she said softly. I told you that the first night. I remember. But that doesn't mean I'm not yours. She smiled, that beautiful smile that still took his breath away. If you want me, Dante set down his wine glass and took her hand. I want you. I've wanted you from the moment you told me to come back at 11 o'clock. I've wanted you every morning in your kitchen, every meeting in that church basement, every moment we've spent together for the past 2 years." "Then what do you want?" she asked, echoing the question that had changed everything. Dante looked at her, this woman who had transformed his life, who had shown him that the most valuable things couldn't be bought. "I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of you. I want to cook beside you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build something together, not an empire of money and fear, but something real, a family, a legacy, a life." Elena's eyes glistened in the candlelight. "That's a lot to want. I know. Is it too much to ask?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she leaned forward and kissed him, soft and sweet, a promise and an answer all at once. "Ask me again in 50 years, she whispered against his lips, "and I'll let you know." Dante laughed, joy bubbling up from somewhere deep inside him. He pulled her close and held her, this woman who had refused his money and demanded his soul, who had broken him down and built him back up as something better. Around them, the party continued. Neighbors talked and laughed, children ran between tables, old wounds slowly healed. The Bellavia neighborhood was alive and thriving, not despite the Cavallos, but because one of them had finally learned what it meant to serve. And in the corner by the window, Dante Cavallo and Elena Ferraro held each other, two people who had found something that couldn't be bought at any price: love,